Hi there, my name's Kevin Awakuni, and I'm a librarian here in the Department of Exploration and Creativity with the Los Angeles Public Library, and I'm here to welcome you to today's LA Made, a Shady Divide. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, our Library Foundation, and our behind-the-scenes staff for helping bring the LA Made programs to you virtually. LA Made focuses on the diverse landscape of Los Angeles, highlighting the immense artistic and performance talent that has developed in the course of the city's eclectic history. If you'd like to see more of our amazing programs, please visit our online calendar at lapl.org/events. And for our LA Made programs, visit lapl.org/LAMade. Our website also has blog posts and video links that highlights the library's diverse resources and upcoming programs. But now into today's program, A Shady Divide with Alejandra Borunda. And just as a reminder, if you'd like to read the issue of National Geographic that features Alejandra's article, right here, uh, please visit our website at lapl.overdrive.com, where you can read this and many other free magazines. So go there now. Well, don't go there now, but go there after. So, in sunny Los Angeles, a lack of tree cover in low-income areas has left many residents especially vulnerable to rising heat. It's a legacy of the city's design as well as its history of racist policies. Journalist Alejandra Borunda documented this shady divide in a cover story for National Geographic, and we'll talk about the history that led to shade inequity across the city, the heat-related dangers arising from a lack of tree canopies in poorer areas, and some of the ways people are trying to fix the problem. Journalist Alejandra Borunda reports on climate change and the environment for National Geographic. Before Nat Geo, she did a PhD in climate science at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, where she used ice cores from the Antarctic to learn about how wind patterns shifted during the last ice age, where giant ice sheets covered much of the planet. She also has a biology undergraduate degree from Pomona, where she studied ecology and nonfiction writing. Now let's welcome to our LA Made stage, Alejandra Borunda. Yay!
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, this is great. We're very excited. So we'll let you take it away.
Yeah, great. Yeah, like I said, super excited to be here and talk about this story, which was just a fascinating project to work on and one that feels really important. Yeah, to me and to everyone else who lives here and has family here and loves this place. So Kevin gave me a really nice introduction, but I'm Alejandra. I work for Nat Geo. I work on our environment desk, which means that we cover basically everything that could be related to climate and the environment anywhere in the world. So if you ever have any ideas or things you'd like to learn about, please reach out. And yeah, this story that we worked on, maybe we can go to the first slide, Steve, if that's okay. Was called A Shady Divide. And I had the great privilege to work on this with an incredible story team at Nat Geo, including the photo editor who kind of conceived of this with me, Samantha Clark, and then a photographer named Elliot Ross, who took most of the pictures you'll see in this presentation, and also our just amazing graphics and mapping team, especially my colleague Riley Champine, who made the graphics you'll see later. And basically, the premise of this story itself, or the question we wanted to ask, was something that feels really both intuitive and was really surprising to me, which is that this thing that's so simple, shade, is not evenly distributed throughout a city like Los Angeles and many others across the country. And we wanted to know why that was, essentially. And when you get into some of the history, you just learn a lot about urban design, about kind of the way that our cities look and why they look that way, and how we can start to change that into the future, all the things Kevin already said in the intro. So I wanted to maybe start just by talking or by asking anyone in the audience to think of a time that you were outside and it was really hot. Just like spend a second thinking about that. Like, can you think about a specific day? And then I guess I would ask you, right? Like, I know what I'm thinking of. Think of a time, or think of what you did to cool yourself down. Did you go inside and find some AC? Like, that would be kind of amazing. That's a lucky thing to have. Or did you just go find someplace shady? That's kind of the most natural and intuitive thing to do, but it's not easy to do everywhere. So just have that image in your brain, because we're going to come back to it later in the presentation, I think. So next slide, please. So just a little outline of what we're going to talk through today. First, because I'm a science nerd, we're going to talk a little bit about the science of heat and what it does to bodies and what's happening with climate change, because of course that's making all of these issues even worse and more acute and important to think about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Los Angeles in particular, and why, although the policies were nationwide, that kind of shaped the city itself, and think about why LA became the kind of shade landscape that it did, and why these big disparities between rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods developed in the first place. And then we'll look at kind of what's happening today, and where the disparities are still really big, and hopefully talk a little bit about what we might be able to do to fix this problem, which I think once you've seen, it will be really hard to unsee. Next slide, please. Okay, cool. So let's start with heat. Why is heat bad? I mean, it's not always bad. It's nice to be warm, especially in the wintertime. But there are a lot of cases where too much heat is really a tough thing, especially for humans and other mammals. You know, we're endotherms. We have this very narrow window in which our bodies can do what they're supposed to do before things really go off the rails. And a major factor there is how much heat we absorb from the air around us, from the sun coming directly under your skin, from touching the wall behind me, which is cold right now. All of that affects kind of how our bodies are able to like take in and then get rid of extra heat. And too much outside, if heat outside, for example, is like beyond that 98.6-ish range that our bodies really like, you get in really big trouble really fast, which I'm sure you all have experienced at some point, just the extreme discomfort of that. And basically, the issue is that heat exacerbates people's other problems in a lot of ways. So if you have a heart problem, if you have some kind of neurological issue, if you have anything that means your body isn't operating in exactly the way that you'd like, being heat stressed means that those other things also get worse. And the other big issue that it brings with it, especially kind of extreme heat, is that it makes air quality a lot worse. Ozone is much more likely to form when it's hot outside. Stagnant air that's like common with a lot of heat waves means that a lot of particulate matter can accumulate in the air. And we're just learning more and more and more about how bad, dirty air hurts our bodies in ways that we don't necessarily see in the short term, but really add up in the long term. Next slide, please. And so the big issue and concern that I personally have, and that I know a lot of others are thinking about really hard right now, is that already we get a lot of extreme heat that's really bad for people's bodies, and climate change is adding to the problem, like basically by the day. And I could go on and on and on about the climate, the mechanisms driving climate change, but to be really brief about it, basically, we know that adding extra greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, CO2, which is a byproduct of a lot of things, but primarily burning fossil fuels, piles up. All these different gases kind of accumulate in the atmosphere, and they trap a lot of heat that the planet is trying to escape, a lot like how our bodies often try to get rid of heat out into the air and keep ourselves at an kind of even temperature. And so all this extra CO2 is basically just messing up that process, and we're adding in a lot more heat And maybe if we go to the next slide and play the animation, I'll just talk through the rest of these points, if you don't mind, Steve. So this is just an animation that I think is really nice that shows the CO2 accumulation since the, 1970s on the left, and the global average temperature or mean land temperature on the right. And you can just see this pretty steady increase in CO2 and pretty steady increase in temperature as well. And the planet has warmed about 1 degree C, which is just under 2 degrees Fahrenheit, since the late 1800s, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a lot. If you think about it, in the last ice age, the whole planet on average was only about 5 degrees colder. So that's a big difference. And even that little bit makes a big effect, or has big effects. It makes extreme heat more extreme. It makes storms stronger. Here in California, we know really well that it increases a wildfire risk, all kinds of stuff. So we can skip 2 slides ahead if that's okay. Yeah, perfect. Or to California. Thank you. In California has warmed a little bit even more than that global average. So it's a little bit more than 1C on average, but in many parts of the state, as you can see in this figure on the right, we're actually well beyond that already. And we experience that very clearly already. Heat waves are more likely. The hottest hots are getting a few degrees warmer. Often the heat waves are lasting longer. And this is only forecast to get worse in the future, although the potential future really depends on how much we do about kind of mitigating climate change now and mitigating our use of fossil fuels now to try to make the problem less bad. We're on track for about 4.5 degrees of warming by the middle of the century, but it could be up to 6. It's a lot. We don't really want that. And just to put that into kind of like why we care context, already we have a lot of deaths and illnesses associated with extreme heat. And we've pretty routinely been undercounting them as well. The LA Times did an incredible series earlier this year where they figured out that the state was probably undercounting heat-related deaths by a factor of 6, and that almost 4,000 people had died from heat exposure in the last decade, which is that's an enormous number. Next slide, please. So clearly the problem is a big and important one that is only going to get harder to deal with in the future and more dangerous for a lot of people. And so there's this basic question of like, what can we do about it? Like, thing number one is to try to deal with climate change, of course. But there's a lot more that we can do on the local level and in our own communities to kind of help deal with the problem if we can't solve the entire problem itself. And so one of the really simple and kind of straightforward and clear ones that people have known about, since there have been people, and other species also clearly understand really intuitively, is shade. It's this classic design tool that helps people deal with extreme heat. And the basic principle there, I think I mentioned earlier, is just that like the less heat you absorb, the less heat you have to get rid of. And that holds for bodies, and it holds for like the structures around us too. So buildings, roads, all kinds of stuff. And less radiation, less like actual sunlight hitting your skin has a really big impact as well. But overall, if you absorb too much heat, or a building absorbs heat, it holds on to it and then slowly gets rid of it. And so that's one of the main factors behind the urban heat island effect that I'm sure you've all heard about many times. And so we know that people have designed around this problem for a long time because people have lived in hot places for a long time. On the right are some diagrams. This is a diagram of the, I actually can't remember where the city is, but this is like a classic Middle Eastern city that has all of these little winding roads and the grayer buildings with little courtyards in between. And they're built really tall so that there's kind of narrow canyon-like walkways between them that like rarely, if ever, get direct sun coming down into them. And by kind of blocking sun from entering into most of the area, they end up keeping themselves much, much cooler than they otherwise might be. And you can kind of see one of those, or see that in the photo, in the middle photo, where you just see very little direct sunlight. And you can see how tall they are in the bottom photo, like this really tall canyon-like structure. Next slide, please. So, actually, can we bump one more slide? I think I switched these. Okay, so LA actually used to be a place in the LA basin, what we now call Los Angeles, used to be a place filled with shade, both natural and built. The Tongva people who lived here since time immemorial lived in areas that were often really tree rich, like many of the kind of river and stream basins or stream areas in the basin were filled with these beautiful old oak trees. And here in this photo, you can see Julia Bogany, who is a Tongva elder who really sadly died earlier, or last year, I guess. But we talked a lot about how her ancestors told her about all of these beautiful shaded spaces that they would spend time in the oak woodlands, in the black walnut woodlands. They would build themselves shade structures to deal with the hottest of the summer heat. And that was even the case after colonial settlers came to California, even though they started clearing a lot of the trees away pretty quickly. But in this painting on the right, you can see that there's still a lot of tree cover in the valley in the late 1800s. Okay, so can you go back one slide? Sorry. Yeah, and so after many different waves of colonial settlers showed up, there started to be a lot more buildings and structures in place. And in many cases, like the Spaniards cleared for grazing, and then later settlers cleared more land and tree area and wetlands and all kinds of different habitats for orchards. But in many cases, they were still conscious of creating shade in their structures. I really like these images because they just talk to me about like how like intentionally people were building in some parts of history. And so the Spanish, when they came, built the grid of the city on a more or less 45-degree angle off of north-south because they had this long-standing law, in fact, to build cities that way in order to maximize both sunlight and shade throughout the year. And you can kind of see in the diagram on the right, and I'm happy to talk through this later if anyone is interested, how taking a grid from a straight north-south to this tilted angle actually means that the building will get both more sun and more shade throughout the day, especially in the summertime. And of course, Spanish architecture in many cases is really heat aware. And so there were lots of loggia, there were lots of places to sit and cool down in the heat of the day. Later, you start to get a lot of transplants from the East Coast of the then US who brought with them their ideas about what neighborhoods should look like or places to live should look like. And in many cases, those were informed by the East Coast, which is full of trees and is very wet. And so everyone wanted their house with their little trees in the backyard and in the front yard. And this kind of aesthetic became just got transplanted here. And so people started putting in lots of trees where maybe there had been ones before, but then had gotten taken away. And they started to build themselves comfortable habitats, usually that had a lot of shade. And there's also some incredible, I didn't put one in here, but there's incredible photographs of old old commerce areas in Los Angeles and lots of parts of downtown, and I mean certainly in other areas like Pasadena and beyond, that were built for walking around in, you know, and doing your shopping by foot. And so there were like loggia, there were arcades, there were lots of awnings, places for people to try to cool down while they were doing the things they needed to do. So maybe skip 2 slides ahead, please. Thank you. So a lot of that started to change in the 20th century. And part of that was because, of course, there was this kind of mythology building around Los Angeles that it was the city of light, that there's incredible quotes from artists and filmmakers about how beautiful and limpid and lucid Los Angeles's light was. And of course, there's just, I mean, everyone is marketing this city as a place to come for health and light and open air. And of course, you also want shade, but that wasn't the driving mentality behind a lot of design precepts at the time. There was even a famous architect who was trying to design a house that was essentially made entirely of glass, like maximize light, which to me is just, but that was kind of the going theory. And particularly as kind of car culture expanded across the city, the priorities really changed. Like if you were building to make things easier for people in their cars instead of people walking on the street, then a lot of times the city ended up tearing out sidewalks, or tearing out the wider median strips, and making way for parking and more car lanes, rather than preserving things that might have been there that would have made life more comfortable for pedestrians. I'll tell the other story that I was going to tell there later. And that's really continued to the present. We're actually seeing a overall decrease in tree canopy across the city now, in many cases because of ongoing development, which is its own really important issue. Like clearly we all need more housing. But particularly as lots get turned into big, the USC researchers who looked at this called the McMansions, that take up a bigger footprint of the lot that they're on. Trees are often the loser. Next slide, please. And the other really big and important factor that has long fed into the change in the shape of the city, and particularly in the shade landscape of the city, was this thing called redlining. And I don't know, is that a term that you've heard before? I hope it is. It's not always the case that people know this, but redlining, as it's colloquially known, generally refers to a set of policies that was enacted in the early 20th century, in which the federal government basically hired surveyors to go out and map different neighborhoods to figure out which ones would be quote unquote safe for federal investment, when they were starting to give out home loans and mortgages. And so these surveyors went out and drew like lines around different parts of the city and different neighborhoods and decided whether they were good neighborhoods or bad neighborhoods. And that was almost always pretty explicitly based on race. So neighborhoods where lots of white people were living were graded A, or green in the map to the right that you can see. And neighborhoods with more Black or brown folks were almost always graded C or D, so yellow and red. And these policies had huge impacts on communities. It meant that it made it easy for people in A-graded neighborhoods to get federally backed mortgages, and hard or impossible for people in C or D graded neighborhoods to get them, and just really changed the flow of money and investment into many different parts of the city. And basically the outcome of this was that money flowed into the rich areas and out of the poor areas, many of which were home to Black and brown folks. And one of the biggest losers in, I don't even know if I'd say biggest losers, one of the biggest impacts that is really clear to me now and that you can see in many different cities across the country is the street infrastructure, and particularly street trees. So trees are usually, especially in public spaces, are usually controlled and cared for by the city. But if the city's not interested in or isn't putting an investment into places, they're one of the first things that often gets left behind. And so there are places where no trees are being planted at all, or where they're being taken out, or where they were getting old and just going uncared for and then would have to get removed at some time or another. And in a lot of cases, there are people who really desperately wanted to keep them, but trees are expensive and they have to be cared for. And if they're going to be a dangerous thing, in many cases, they would just get lost. Next slide, please. And so one of the really crucial things is that these policies, these redlining policies, officially ended in the 1960s, but their impacts are very clearly still felt in the city and beyond. This is a graphic that Mike Riley made for us, and you can see here that the city is still really segregated within these formerly redlined communities, and that wealth distribution is really clearly correlated with that still. So even once the policies were no longer in place, their impacts have persisted. Next slide, please. So this is just a question. So where do you think most of the shade in the city is now? And if you had to guess, like, what do you think, like, how much canopy cover do you think there is in those really shady areas? And canopy cover is basically like if you look above you and have to guess how much of the sky you can see above your head. Can you see 50% of the area? Is it blue? Or is it 20%? I mean, that'd be amazing. Is it 100% of the sky that you can see? So where do you think? I realize I can't actually get answers, but think about that. Next slide. So here are the answers. In neighborhoods that were formerly graded A under that redlining system, on average, there's 30% tree canopy cover. So about, 40% of the sky above you is covered by trees, and 60% is sky. That's pretty good. That's kind of amazing. And in some parts of the city, it's way higher than that. And the stat that like blew my mind when we were reporting this was that, this is up on the screen, but I'll just read it out. Nearly 20% of the city's trees are found in just 5 census blocks, I think mostly in the Hollywood Hills. And they are home, those 5 census blocks are home to just 1% of LA's population. That's just a mind-boggling stat to me. And the tree canopy cover just decreases steadily as you go down the alphabet of those different grades. So in formerly B graded areas, there's 20% average canopy cover, and C it's 20. And once you get to the D graded areas, it's down to 17. But honestly, to me, 17 feels high given what we saw on the ground. We spent a lot of time in parts of South Central and South LA and parts of East LA where, the canopy cover was like 1 to 2%, which that's like a couple trees on a block. And so the main thing to take away from this is that there's these really big differences in tree canopy cover in the areas that were graded A versus those that were graded C or D. And those are still really highly correlated with race and class in the city that we live in today. Next slide, please. So for this story, what we did was we wanted to just drive along one street to do what's called a transect and cut across the city through some of those A-graded neighborhoods, B, C, and D, and see if we could kind of see for ourselves how that changed as you went along the transect. So we ended up driving both north-south and south-north along Vermont Ave from basically the entrance to the park up in the top there, down through South Los Angeles. And if there's any photo nerds in the audience, you might recognize this kind of concept. It's based on, there's a famous photographer named Ed Rauscha who did a series called Every Building on the Sunset Strip, and he went and just photographed the entire, every building on the Sunset Strip, and it's a really compelling and interesting project. And so we kind of wanted to recreate that with this tree project, with this shade project here. And I honestly really think this picture says it all. So we've got the A graded neighborhood at the top and the D at the bottom. And I mean, can you unsee this? Like, those are different worlds that people are living in all of those different neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, so these are just a couple more comparison images that Elliot made from a helicopter flying over the city. And I think this is somewhere in Palos Verdes and somewhere in South LA again. And you can just see the difference so clearly. The trees are just literally bursting out from the spaces between houses in this area. And I could probably count on two hands the trees in the image on the right. Next slide, please. Just another comparison. This is up by the entrance to Griffith Park, where there are these incredible, beautiful old Moreton Bay fig trees that were planted in the early 1900s. And they, like the tree well underneath this tree on the left is, I think I measured and it's like 8 feet wide and 16 feet long. And the branches of these trees reach so far that they overlap in the middle of the median. And this is a really wide street if you've ever been up there. And so people were lounging on this big grassy median strip in the shade of the hottest part of the day. And when we were up there, I had to put on a sweater because it was so cool. Whereas much farther down Vermont, south on Vermont, when we drove, this is not a picture, this is an industry city. I wished I were wearing shorts. And so there's this like really clear visceral feeling that you can get doing just like a baby little experiment like this. Next slide, please. So Riley did an incredible job of kind of mapping out what this means for heat, not just, for aesthetic purposes or because people really like trees, but there's really big physical impacts of having trees in some places and not in others. And so on the left, sorry, I think this is left for you. In the green part, you can see the tree cover across central Los Angeles. And up in the hills, you can see just like tons and tons and tons of trees. And then there's some places where there's barely any green at all. And that map, as you can see on the right, is super tightly correlated with temperatures on the ground. And where there are not trees, temperatures are way, way, way hotter. Next slide, please. UCLA researchers went out and actually used infrared cameras to kind of test the ground temperature, not the air temperature, but like the concrete. And they were finding differences of like 30 to 40 degrees between shaded areas and unshaded areas. A tree blocking a house can drop the temperature of the house by almost 20 degrees where it's shading it. It can drop overall energy costs used to cool a home by about 10% in some studies. All of these are just incredible numbers. And to me, the thing that really was compelling was this idea that people living in a place with less trees and more heat, like up to 10 degrees difference in some cases of the air temperature, not just the ground temperature, are living in a different world. Like, think about that during a heat wave. If the temperature that's getting reported on the TV is 100 degrees or 105 degrees, in some parts of the city, you could be experiencing 115, and in others, you could be experiencing 95. That's, I mean, actually, it'd be a little bit less than that. I'm sorry, I did that math wrong. But like, regardless, that's a huge, huge different life experience and different experience of that heat wave. And for me, the way that I've been thinking about it is that the people who are living in a place with less trees and more heat are essentially already living in our climate changed future. They're in that world that is on average 4 or 5 or 6 degrees hotter. And like, at that point, when we get to that actually climate change future, they're going to be experiencing, you know, something another 10 or 20 or 30 years down the line. And that's an incredible burden to put on people who, yeah. And I think it's also really important to remember and recognize that the impacts of heat itself and heat deaths and morbidity issues, so heat and deaths and illnesses, is really clearly also unevenly distributed throughout the city. And particularly older Black folks are almost 2 to 3 times more likely to die or get really sick during a heat wave event than older white folks. Those numbers are, they have to be really tightly related with the environments in which people are living. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, so I think I actually covered all this already, but on that transect that we did along Vermont Avenue, we walked along, actually this wasn't quite on the transect, but this was a few blocks off Vermont. I went on a walk with some really wonderful researchers and activists who have been trying to put in more trees throughout the city. And they were going out just to map and figure out like where you could actually put in trees easily. And one of the problems is that it's like not super simple to put in trees. There's a lot of rules and regulations, and there's not always a lot of space on the streets. So in the neighborhood that we were in South Central, we walked up and down this one block. There were 9 trees on that block. They're mostly small. They're maybe a few feet taller than me, and I'm, you know, a couple inches over 5 feet. One was big, I think, maybe 2. There are a few dozen tree wells, so like places you could put trees if you wanted and had all these different city approvals and stuff. But they're all pretty narrow. They're maybe 3 or 4 feet wide. In many cases, where we thought was supposed to be a place, like a little grassy place that you could plant a tree, it was filled in with concrete. In a couple other places, they're like, oh, that's actually too close to a driveway. So in the end, even in the best case scenario, they would have been able to add 16 more trees on that block, which would make a huge difference, but would not get you to probably anywhere near 37% canopy cover, but it would definitely be better than nothing. Then later on, I forget if it was that same day or later on, we drove up to Los Feliz, and we up to this big, the Morton Bay fig zone, and you could barely see the sun. These trees were enormous. Their roots were enormous, which is actually another problem. They'd been growing for 100 years, and the entire feel of the place physically was just totally different. And one of the things that's just really remarkable to me too is that in many of the places where we have the least shade, people have to be outside most often. People are walking to the store, they're waiting for a bus, they're outside to go about their daily life. and they're exposed to all the heat. And in many of the places that have the most shade, like, people have AC. And so there's this big question of equity and how we make a healthy, livable city available and just accessible to everyone, especially the people who are feeling the heat the most. Next slide, please. So what can we do? What's happening already? What are people doing to try to fix this problem? I will say that LA is pretty far ahead of the game in recognizing its problems. There's only a couple cities in the US, I think, that have had a longer, more ambitious kind of attempt to change the tree canopy and the shape of the tree canopy in particular within their bounds. There's a lot happening right now. The city's design, quote unquote, designs are, this is very much on his radar. He's run a couple contests to get people to design more walkable streets. They're trying to figure out how to incorporate shade structures into, or more shade structures into bus stops and all kinds of other parts of the built environment. This image to the right is of a very futuristic, cool thing that some UCLA designers are working on that would not just provide shade, but would actually do a thing called radiative cooling. So these panels would be chilly, just because of some really cool physics. And so they wouldn't require any energy, they wouldn't require any electricity, they just would be able to cool themselves and the people standing nearby. And of course, one of the big goals is to kind of reduce the car dependence and take some of the streets back for people and pedestrians rather than cars. And in doing so, really prioritize making streets comfortable places to be. And then the other big effort is some really ambitious tree planting campaigns across the city. The city has a goal of planting 90,000 trees by, it was supposed to be 2021. Things have gotten a little delayed, I think, but they're doing a lot to get there. And they're really focusing on neighborhoods that have historically not gotten the investment that the A-grade neighborhoods have. So they're focusing most of their planting in this formerly, in more or less in what were formerly C or D graded neighborhoods under that redlining schema. Next slide, please. And then, of course, because people are incredibly resourceful, there are a lot of folks who are taking this into their own hands. And so all over, and particularly lots of Latino communities across East LA, different parts of the city, this is where a lot of my family was from originally, people are building their own beautiful shade structures. Elliot went around and photographed so many of these, and you can just see these incredibly creative ways that people are making their home spaces comfortable throughout the heat of the summer. There's an urban planner who I talked to a couple of times named James Rojas, who's been cataloging a lot of these impromptu shade structures and really trying to bring attention to how creative and special they can be. And yeah, so build your own shade. If shade is not forthcoming, do what you can to find your own. Next slide, please. And of course, there's lots of other ways that you can get involved. I always want to make sure that we're talking about the fact that these are big structural problems. They've got a lot of history behind them, as we talked about. And like we saw, even though the policies that kind of kickstarted some of the disinvestment in lots of Black and brown neighborhoods are no longer in place, there are other ones that have replaced them. There is inertia in the system, and so clearly the system is still not equitable, and so no one person is responsible for fixing that on their own. But there's a lot to do to make the area that you live in, that your family lives in, more closely resemble the world that we all wish we lived in. And so there's lots of different tree planting campaigns, I think, that I would really love to see get a lot of attention, because the people I talked to who were working for them were just so wonderful and so dedicated and so had such a clear vision of what they wanted their city to look like in the future. And I really hope that they can achieve everything they're dreaming of. So Tree People, Northeast Trees, there's lots of other local community scale projects to work on. And there's just no shortage of things to do to try to get involved in addressing these really big, deep problems. Next slide, please. But yeah, I think the most important thing to me, at least as a starting place, is to really be able to see this clearly. Once you see this and kind of put this pattern together, I hope you won't be able to unsee it. I definitely can't. It's the first thing I notice whenever I drive to a new city or town now. I'm like, oh, are there lots of trees here? I wonder what the urban planning history was. I wonder if this was a redlined area or an A-graded area. And usually when I look it up, I got it right. So you can do the same for yourself. I didn't put this in the anywhere in the slideshow, but the University of Virginia has a really incredible resource where they've digitized all of the redlining maps, and you can go through and like click on each little block zone and read the original language that was associated with those maps and policies, and it's really stunning. So I would encourage everyone, if you have a chance, to go do that. But yeah, I think just really important is to be able to look outside at the world we live in and try to understand both the history and the potential for the future. And then get involved in local government, which is a message I'm sure everyone hears over and over again, but there's no other solution. Well, not no other solution, but it's a really important part of the project. I think that's it. So next slide. Yeah, that's basically it. This was a fascinating project to work on, and I hope that this presentation captured even a part of it. But if you have any questions, please reach out to me. That's my Twitter handle, and I really hope to follow up on this at some point in the next couple of years, and maybe I'll hear about some incredible work that all of you have done to try to deal with the problem. Thank you so much. And questions now, I think.
There was a comment. Let me bring it up. Here it is. It was from, let's make us even, Steve. It was from Northeast Trees. Thank you, Alejandra, for shedding a light on the environmental injustices of tree canopy scarcity in our city. Fixing these inequities is our mission at Northeast Trees, and it means the world to us to have these stories reach a global audience. So it's a nice comment for you.
Yeah, thank you, Northeast Trees. I spent some time with some of their crews planting. Oh gosh, I'm not going to remember where we were right now, but it was just a wonderful group of people who were so enthused about doing this really backbreaking work over and over and over again. But I think they got like 20 trees in the day that we were with them, and then the plans were really incredible. So wow. Thanks for all the work you're doing.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions. Kind of just from the very beginning, what sparked the idea for this article?
That's a good question. So Samantha and I both have really been focused on environmental justice reporting and stories for a while, and we were looking for something that felt visual in a way. And so I think for her, for the photo side, they were like, wow, this is a really clear way to see some of these patterns that we kind of know about in the abstract, but don't usually have kind of a really physical or like visible physical manifestation. We hear a lot in kind of the environmental justice conversations about air pollution, or when communities end up with like industrial stuff in their midst. And I mean, I guess that's also visual, but it felt really important. And I, coming from a climate background, have been just really worried about how we're going to start to adapt, because we're at the point where we just need to do everything we can to keep up with the changes and ideally get ahead of them. And extreme heat is just like such a clear example of that. It's just a problem that we have not given enough attention to already and is getting so much worse. And so together we were kind of thinking about where we could look at some of these stories. Mm-hmm. And we both read a beautiful Places Journal article by Sam Block, which we should also link to, which I think covers a lot of the ground that we looked at and more even, that kind of brought up this question. And we were like, oh, it would be great if we could also look at this issue. And like LA, I've got a lot of family here. It's a place that I have spent a lot of time and a place that I care about a lot. And it is such a beautiful place with so much potential to change right now too. So we were really, really glad to get to spend a lot more time in the community kind of figuring out how that could happen.
Yeah. A couple more comments have come in since. School playgrounds in the southern neighborhoods also have less shade, and also mentioned that the school playgrounds have a lot of asphalt instead of grass, which makes it really hot. So I guess it kind of speaks to the points that you were talking about earlier about the inequities in that case as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating to me about this whole topic is how tied together all of these different pieces are. Like less trees mean you're getting more sunlight hitting the asphalt, and more sunlight hitting the asphalt means the asphalt gets hotter during the day, which means that it can't cool down as much at night, which means that it's hotter in these neighborhoods at night, which is one of the biggest issues for like health and extreme heat, is that when people's bodies can't cool down at night, they end up with much worse overall health effects. And so you've got this like layering of issues kind of all working together to make the problem worse.
Right, a vicious cycle, just kind of never ends.
Yeah, but that's a great point, Freddie.
Yeah. Diane had a question. So I believe to maintain trees is very expensive. I know that can be a reason homeowners have issues to maintain trees on their properties. I don't know, can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important part of this as well. And so I think I didn't do a great job of this in the presentation or the story, I think, but there's a difference between kind of trees on private property and trees on public property. Mm-hmm. And so we were mostly focusing on trees on public property that the city's supposed to be taking care of in some way or another. But to Diane's point, in a lot of cases, the city both historically has not been able to keep up with that necessary care, or even in the present hasn't quite caught up with it, even though I think they're trying really hard. And so it's often fallen on people who live next to one of these trees, or in front of them, to take care of them. And like Diane said, that's really expensive. Like hiring tree people is tough. And it can be dangerous to go without the care. So you kind of are like locked into this need and kind of unexpected or unwanted expense for a thing that like really shouldn't have to be your responsibility necessarily. And so that's been a really tricky issue, I think, across the city. And in many cases where we see really old, big, beautiful trees today, like some of those Moreton Bay figs, the people living on those blocks have ended up chipping in a lot of money to take care of them and to preserve them. But that's an incredible luxury to to be able to do and to choose to do.
Right. And then let me ask you this. Does like water consumption come into play when it comes to like, because we're always in a kind of a cycles of drought, and I know that, trees require water, and does that kind of factor into all of this in some capacity?
Yeah, totally. I had a whole other section about cut from the story from length, but it's or for length, but it's the life of a journalist.
Sure.
That's a really good question though, Kevin. It's a big issue, particularly for young trees, which require some water and care. But overall, in the grand scheme of water consumption, it would not be the make or break piece for LA, and trees actually end up helping kind of funnel, well, when they're not entirely surrounded by asphalt, they can help to kind of bring some of the whatever little rainwater we get back down into the soil. And I will also say that I think the folks that I talk to on the tree planting end of things have done a really good job of trying to think about that in terms of what they're planting where. And they have a really thoughtful approach to picking trees that are going to be able to deal with hotter temperatures, trees that require less water, trees that will do less to mess up the sidewalks, like all of those big figs. So there's the people who are trying to do this are thinking about it. But yeah, I thought a lot about water, and I thought a lot about fire. It's like, what happens if you put a lot more trees in?
Yeah. Freddie had one more comment. He said, water equals water bills that can't be afforded in poor neighborhoods. That is something that kind of, I guess, factors into something like that as well. So
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And so that's like one of the, I think in some cases, one of the things that the tree planting groups have been trying to do is make sure that they can actually take care of the trees, particularly in their kind of baby stages, which is the time when they like need actually to be watered. After they're bigger, most of the trees can kind of like handle themselves, but in those early phases, they need a little more attention and water. And so, yeah, they've been finding volunteers. Like if someone wants a tree in front of their house, they're asking them to take charge of watering them. But like we said, that can be a big
expense. Yeah,
that can be a big expense. So
yeah,
it's an imperfect system, but.
City Plants here as a comment. Hi, Alejandra. Just a note to say thank you for your work. We have incorporated a lot of your story into programming here in Los Angeles. Oh, that's nice.
City Plants folks.
So we're just about out of time. Any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
I think I just want to say thank you to everyone for listening and tuning in and thinking about this and caring about it. And I really hope that I do get to revisit some of this in the future, because I'm so sure that like I was just the people I talked to and worked to and had the great privilege of interacting with for this story were truly wonderful, and so dedicated and so smart and so on top of their game. And I hope that they can achieve everything that they've set out to.
Yeah, City Plants had one more comment, including a tree ambassador. Promote forestal programs in low canopy communities to help close the shade and equity gap. Oh, yeah, it's a great idea.
Yeah.
So everyone do that.
Yeah, do that.
All right.
But
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and presenting this really interesting and thoughtful story. And I hope people got a lot out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, looking forward to hearing more from all of you at some point. Please reach out. I'm always really happy to hear from people.
All right. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us for today's LA Made programs. And remember to check out the library's online calendar at lapl.org/events. And don't forget to check out our next LA Made program on Thursday, February 3rd at 4 p.m., where we welcome Chef Jet Tila to our LA Made stage. Chef Jet Tila knows a thing or two about Thai cuisine. Growing up in Los Angeles, he spent time learning the ancient traditions of Asian cuisine from his Cantonese grandmother and working in the famed Bangkok market. Step inside Jet's kitchen and learn the secrets to making your favorite Thai dishes taste better than takeout. Participants will also have an opportunity to win a free copy of Jet's newest book. Until next time, we truly appreciate all your support. The success of LA Made and literally all of our library programs could not happen without viewers like you. So thank you very much and have an awesome day.